This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Thank you for tuning in and joining me. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Amanda Hernandez to the show. Amanda Hernandez is an assistant professor of sociology and affiliate faculty member of the Feminist Studies and Race and Ethnicity Studies programs at Southwestern University. She is a proud graduate of San Antonio Community College. She received her BA in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of Texas at San Antonio and her MA and PhD in sociology from Baylor University. Her work focuses on the ways that white supremacy and sexism show up in U.S. Christian groups. She is the author of Intersectional Identities of Christian Women in the United States, Faith, Race, and Feminism from Lexington Books in 2024, and that is the topic of our conversation today. Her work has been published in Conscience Magazine, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and Sociological Spectrum. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Amanda Hernandez. Dr. Amanda Hernandez, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
I am delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can just kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, my name is Amanda. I am a sociologist, a writer, and a lifelong overthinker about religion and culture. I currently teach at Southwestern University, where I get to teach and think with students about race, gender, power, and specifically with my work in the context of U.S. Christianity. I'm someone who has been inside and outside of religious Christian spaces, and so I bring all of these things to my work. But outside of my work, I'm a parent and a partner. I have two very mischievous cats who I love very much. They have been locked out of the room, and they will attempt to break down the door at some point in the next hour. My hobbies are reading, really just I read extensively, lounging, drinking beverages on patios, any kind of beverage on any kind of patio. But that's me.
Wonderful. Well, I want to know a little bit about your intellectual and academic path as well. I know that I've read a lot of your book recently, so I know a little bit about your family backstory related to religion just a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can just, give any relevant backstory related to religion that kind of led you into this path, that, led to your career.
I grew up in a really large, blended, working, poor Mexican-American family in San Antonio, Texas. When I say blended family, I mean both of my parents had children from previous relationships, and then me and my brother in their relationship. So not only were we blended in that capacity, but blended religiously. My mother grew up Southern Baptist, my dad grew up Catholic. And so growing up, there was always new churches, different spaces we were in. And so even though we went to a bunch of different churches, we ended up, like, I think a lot of people at a mega non-denominational church. I don't know are you familiar with Cornerstone Church?
Oh, yeah, I am actually.
Okay, so I spent a lot of my adolescence and early adulthood as a member of Cornerstone Church. For those who are unfamiliar, Cornerstone is a mega non-denominational church in San Antonio whose pastor is John Hagee. He is an extremely conservative right-wing pastor who was very close with Trump during his first presidency, and is a very vocal Zionist, hosts lots of pro-Israel events and stuff. And so this is like the space I grew up in. I had a purity ring. I made a purity pledge. I was just all in on
Sure.
this culture. I got married at 19 as a result of that because of course in this sort of subculture as a young woman I'm socialized to think that the best and most moral thing I can do with my life is get married and have a kid. So that's what I did. Married at 19, I had my son at 21, and very quickly, especially after having my son, realized that I could not sustain being in this culture. I just personally couldn't believe a God that would want people to suffer just because of the way he made them.
Hmm.
And so I ended up a divorced single mother. And I was working at the mall and I was just like, cool. And both of my parents, even now, my dad works at the mall. My mom has always worked food service. And I didn't know anybody who went to college. And the only reason I enrolled at my community college in San Antonio was because they had an early childhood center. So I was like, well, I can get free childcare. I don't know, get a 2-year certificate, like counseling or something. And because I was not like a college kid, I never took the SAT or the ACT. In Texas, they have you take something called the TSI, called the Success Initiative. I had to Google it. I literally did not know what it stood for. But I did not score college level for anything. It was like I needed to be in remedial math, remedial English. For me,
Same here. Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, I guess I'm just an idiot.
Yeah.
And so I had met with an advisor, and the advisor was like, "You seem like it's fine. You can take a normal class." Like she like let me take the honors English course I had accidentally enrolled in because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And that's just like really where it all started. I think I got really lucky by having instructors who knew I was there out of curiosity and to learn. And I just had really amazing mentorship all through my undergrad experience. At community college, the professors were like, you can keep doing, like, if you like this, you can get paid to go to graduate school. And I was like, what's graduate school? And
Yeah.
I remember meeting with one of them. He was a historian. And I remember looking at his degrees on the wall and it said Doctor of Philosophy. And I was so confused. I was like, but you teach history, not philosophy. Like, why does your degree say Doctor of Philosophy? I remember him explaining that to me. And it was just, it's so funny to look back on that now. But I ended up transferring to the 4-year institution here in San Antonio, the University of Texas at San Antonio, where I majored in women's and gender studies and minored in sociology. And that was like a huge turning point for me, being a gender studies major, because I remember going into the 4-year university really feeling and like I had internalized the belief like religion fucked me over. Christianity is not redeemable for me. And you would think, and I think most people would think, that getting what was essentially a degree in feminism would solidify those ideas for me. And they really didn't. It really complicated that. The coursework that I took in women and gender studies and sociology pushed me to see how that was really kind of problematic for me to think that. And I think what happened is that I was in the right place at the right time at UTSA because at the time, the Women and Gender Studies program was almost all taught by Chicana feminists. And at the same time, the sociology program only had essentially sociologists of religion. So I'm taking coursework in both these things at the same time, and I'm going, oh, actually, religion and feminism aren't always contradictory, and they
Hmm.
look really different. And again, I really think I'm in the right place at the right time. So I'm sort of seeing these things come together in my undergraduate career. And then by the time I'm going to grad school, because I'm divorced and co parenting, I'm only applying to schools, fully funded PhD programs in Texas. And luckily, Baylor's one of them. And again, right place, right time. Baylor's one of their tracks specifically focuses on sociology of religion. And so I was extremely well trained and well networked at Baylor. The sort of structure at Baylor is that students are expected to do a 3-article quantitative dissertation, meaning like you would have a theme for your dissertation, but you would do 3 separate quantitative statistical articles on the topic. And from the jump, I was like, I don't want to do that. And My professors were extremely supportive. They're like, okay, like if you don't want to do that, here's how we get you from A to B. That's what I did, and that's ultimately what ended up becoming the book project. And I'm just so glad it's finally out in the world, and now that I'm getting to talk to people about it.
Love it. Well, let's talk about the book. It's called Intersectional Identities of Christian Women in the United States: Faith, Race, and Feminism. The introduction chapter is called Christian Feminists, Oxymoron. And so I'm curious if you can just elaborate a little bit more on the oxymoron aspect of that title, because it's just so alluring to me as a reader and as a person who pays attention to religion and society in the United States today.
So, sort of like what I alluded to earlier, right? There's out in the ether this idea that feminism and religion, but in the US specifically, Christianity, like they don't go together at all. I went into my own undergraduate career really having internalized that idea. I think lots of people feel that way. And the argument that I make throughout the book is that even though that's the perception that feminism and Christianity are oxymoron, they don't go together, they don't fit. This perception comes from essentially white supremacy. And what I mean by that is that there's two popular forms of these identities, white feminism and white Christianity. Those are the most visible, the most loudest, in your face, popular versions of those things. So when those are at the forefront, they do become antithetical. But there are lots of ways to be a feminist, and there are lots of ways to be a Christian, and they're not always in opposition to one another.
Okay, so let's talk about this. You kind of talked about your growing up and your, your path through life, and something in the preface really captured my attention. That's the script of the good Christian girl, and so it seems to have backfired for you. But what are you noticing as a person who, once you realize that it had backfired for you, tell me what you start noticing about society in general once you kind of realize this script was out there for so many women.
Gosh, that's so hard to answer because I wrestle with this almost on the daily, just because I'm so interested in the ways that this shows up in popular culture. For example, I've been really into The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives right
Mm,
now,
yeah.
the reality show on Hulu. And I think there's a tension between the idea we have that religious spaces are uniquely oppressive to women, that the script of the good Christian girl is this idea that you will behave in ways that are feminine. You will be sexually pure. You will remain sexually pure until you are married in a monogamous heterosexual relationship with a straight man. You'll have sex, but only to make babies, and you
Hmm.
will have so much fulfillment in your role as a mother. And I mean, for me personally, that did not end up working out. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people. It was a struggle for almost majority of the women I interviewed for this book. It's a struggle for the women on Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
Hmm.
And it's not a uniquely religious experience. That same script exists in broader society. Maybe the language is a little bit different. Maybe the justifications are a little bit different. But you can talk to people who've grown up in other religious traditions, or you can talk to people who grew up completely a-religious. And women often still have the same expectations of sexual purity, motherhood, nurturance. It just takes on different flavors depending on your subcultural background.
Hmm. So you mentioned the participants. Tell me a little bit about the research and data gathering process for you that you did for the book.
So I interviewed 48 Christian women. The only sort of inclusion criteria was, are you a woman? Are you Christian? Are you over 18? I'd love to talk to you. Um, I had started data collection in the summer of 2019. And it was kind of slow going. You know, I was having a few interviews here and there. I'd meet folks in coffee shops, or I was on Zoom before everybody was on Zoom. And then
Hmm.
COVID happened. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm never going to be able to finish this project. The world is shutting down. People aren't going to have time for this. And I remember during spring break, so March 2020, I was still on Twitter at the time, and I had posted sort of like an ad. Hey, I'd love to talk to you if XYZ. And I had so many DMs,
Cool.
and so many people were like, I am so bored. Can I please just talk to you? Oh, I'm so excited to have something to do.
Yeah.
And I talk about this in the book a little bit of like the very fact that it was the people I were talking to were people who were bored during COVID lockdowns means that they probably had a job they could move to remote. A lot of them, there were some that were caretakers, but not a lot. And so when I look at the demographic breakdown of my sample, most of them are college educated, had a job that wasn't considered quote unquote essential. So they're not doing like service work during this time. Of the few participants I interviewed that would be considered lower to working class, I did interview them before the pandemic. And so I think that kind of shows up in my sample a bit.
So I want to get into a couple of these terms that you have in the book. One is white feminism, and the other one is white Christianity. So I want to talk about white feminism first. So can you describe to me kind of how you envision, how you see white feminism and what that is, who is included, who is excluded, why that matters?
So, the simplest way that I can think of to explain white feminism is feminism that does not want to change anything about our structure. It just wants to make women part of it too. If you think about like Betty Friedan writing the or the feminine mystique back in the 60s, she's writing about upper working class women who have jobs or maybe don't, but they feel that something is wrong in their lives and they can't quite put their finger on it. And it's this male oppression that they experience. It was groundbreaking at the time. Lots of people are like, yeah, Betty, we get it. And she did found the National Organization for Women, so she was doing that work. Famously, in feminist circles, she gets critiqued very heavily by bell hooks. And bell hooks is like, who's this feminism for? This does not include the experiences of poor women, of Black women, of Latinas, of Asian women. These women have already been in the workforce, Betty. Like, what are you talking about? And the way I explain this to students as well is when we think about white feminism, it says, well, we can keep doing oppression, but maybe a woman could do it. Maybe it could be a lady CEO extracting labor from her employees.
Hmm.
And so it really just leaves behind everybody who A cannot either go up in the ranks at their job or place of employment. It leaves out people who want to see fundamental structural change that the system doesn't have to be oppressive to anybody. You don't have to have a girl boss figurehead at the top and slap a feminist sticker on it.
Okay, cool. That's a great description. So let's tie in white Christianity. This seems like a fairly uniquely American experience, and I would love to know a little bit about how you see white Christianity.
This one's complex because a lot of scholars are contemporarily debating what this means and what this looks like. The way that I conceptualize white Christianity in the book, in my teaching, in my own thinking is, again, that uniquely US manifestation that in order to be a good American, you have to be a good Christian. And this by virtue conflates white identity, assimilating to US values. And it's often that really loud version that we see in the news.
Hmm.
It's not, okay, a good example of this is like whenever Donald Trump gets asked a question about theology, he doesn't have to actually know anything about the Bible.
Yeah, he clearly doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah, he doesn't have to say anything articulate. It's just the idea of like, well, God wants America to be great. God has uniquely set America apart. And if we don't follow traditional gender hierarchies, if we don't follow traditional racial hierarchies, God will smite us or whatever. A few scholars writing in this area who say all of this much more eloquently would be sociologists like Sam Perry, Andrew Whitehead, Philip Gorski, and then historians Anthea Butler and Robert Jones over at PRRI. Very quickly, that's just sort of how I internalize and think about it.
Excellent. So when we think about feminism and Christianity right now in the US, it seems like whiteness seems to be like the standard default to both of those concepts, even though there are clearly, non-white feminists and clearly non-white Christians. And so talk to me a little bit about that default status and how that excludes.
Yeah, so the thing that's interesting about something like white feminism or white Christianity is that you don't necessarily have to even be white to adhere to it.
Mm.
And that's because of the idea of whiteness as a standard or a norm. And we see this in so many different arenas. This is just my specific focus. But by that, what I mean is when we look at our social world, white individuals are considered just people. That's just a person. Everyone else gets a qualifier added to them. So the example I give in class is something like, when you signed up for the sociology of gender class, what did you think we were going to talk about? And everyone says, oh, well, it's a sociology of gender class, so we're going to talk about women. And I say, do men have gender? And they say, yeah, men have gender. And I say, well, why didn't you think we would talk about men then in a gender class? Because men are the dominant group, so they become invisible, they become normalized. That's just to be human. And the same thing goes with race. I say to them, when you signed up for this sociology of race and ethnicity class, what did you think we would talk about? Oh, the experiences of Black people, the experience of Latinx people. And then I say, do white people have a race? And then they start getting uncomfortable, right? And then we talk about why that is the case. And so that's what I mean when I say whiteness is the standard, it's the default, becomes invisible. And when it becomes invisible, people don't have or want to talk about it. And so that's why my work is trying to make visible that this is white feminism, this is white Christianity, and problematize like, well, now we've made it visible. Now we can see the repercussions and consequences of it.
So, in the book, you also talk about the statistics of reported feminists among various religious traditions for women. And I'm just wondering if you can give a broad overview of what you think listeners should know about the reported feminism among various religious traditions.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think people should know that there are religious feminists. There are people who come from all sorts of Christian denominational backgrounds who would call themselves feminist. It varies. So if you look at like evangelicals compared to mainlines, you're going to have more people who say that they identify as feminist in mainline groups compared to evangelicals. But they're still there. And it's not just a small percentage, it's upwards of like 30-40% of
Hmm.
evangelicals who say, yeah, I'm a feminist. And of course, in a survey, there's limitations. Someone could mark down, I'm feminist in a survey, but what does that mean to them? We don't really know, which is why I wanted to talk to people about it. I also think people should know that when you look at the population as a whole, and you're not even breaking down by religious tradition, it's only, again, like 40-ish% of people who would say they're a feminist. So religious feminists look a lot like quote unquote secular feminists on survey measures. What do they actually think and believe? That gets a little more complicated, but on the surface, they look pretty similar.
So, just a little bit about the book too. You talk about your experience of studying some foundational feminist texts. And you had an interesting point that jumped out at me about how the perception of feminism and Christianity as contradictory stems from the second wave. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about that, just that basic history behind that second wave connection, where that incompatibility, almost belief or myth or whatever you want to call it, where that stems from.
Sure. So in the first chapter of the book, I am comparing text from the second wave of feminism. So what I'm doing is looking at the ways that um, feminists at that time were thinking and talking about religion. And the way I do that is by doing a content analysis of two books. I look at The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan and The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And what I'm saying is like, these are the two books that people are like, this launched the second wave. This changed the political landscape. This changed the way that women were thinking about women's liberation, etc. And so when you go through those books, those writers are, for lack of a better word, rather hostile to religion. De Beauvoir specifically has some really strong language for those who are religious. She basically says, women are, if you're religious, you are culpable for your own oppression, is sort of her perspective on that. Betty Friedan is very interesting because in The Feminine Mystique, there's like a few throwaway lines about religion, but she was also the co-founder of the National Organization for Women Now, and Now used religion very strategically. So they would have religious people be vocal mouthpieces for the organization, and they used it to gain like respectability leverage, basically, on the political landscape. So Betty was a little more complicated when it came to religion, but on the whole was very not, I don't want to say anti-religion, but would hold it at an arm's length and use it strategically when it would benefit the organization. So this is like the popular idea, right? Like the feminists, they don't like religion. And then later in that chapter, I bring in two other books, two other texts that are usually used in like feminist studies classrooms that women of color are writing. And in those texts, religion is not contradictory to liberation, to feminism. That's just part of their identity. And sure, there's like issues that need to be worked through, but it's not something that's separate to their identities. That's kind of what I'm arguing in that chapter is like laying the groundwork for like, but who is it contradictory for? And that does not necessarily need to be the case.
Nice. Okay, so chapter two talks about the impossible standards, right? And in the chapter talks about how impossible standards and how women realize the impossible standards, how that serves as like an entryway to process their own questioning and critique the traditions in which they grew up in. Is that a pretty standard reply that you saw? Like women being like, wow, I can't meet this standard. So now it opens the door for me to critiquing what I've been told my whole life. Is that pretty common?
Oh, absolutely. That was my own experience. And when I sat down and talked with women, that was definitely theirs. On my interview scripts, my questions were pretty vague. I was very diligent and worked very hard not to ask leading questions. I did not share about my experiences up front because I didn't want them to try and give me answers that they thought I just wanted to hear. And sometimes that meant I heard some really off the wall stuff that I hope they don't think I agreed with. But so I just chalk that up to me doing my job well. Um, but by and large, women would share stories with me that were, I mean, it was trauma, like what they experienced,
Hmm.
of being stalked, experiencing sexual violence, of just being told that they couldn't even speak up in Bible classes. And so a lot of them internalized the ideas in the same ways that I kind of talked about for myself. But then something happens where they're like, I don't think God actually feels that way, or I don't get to be a whole person if I do these things. And so they would and I think in really advanced ways, be able to critique their own situations. And like you said, it ultimately opened up a path, a door to feminism for a lot of the people I talked to.
Yeah. What did you what is a couple of standout major things you learned about the experiences regarding queerness or LGBTQ women who are a part of your study? Was there anything involving sexuality and sexual orientation that pops up in your study?
Gosh, yes, so much. And that's a really meaty chapter where it really is all of the things that we tend to think about when we think about Christians and feminists, which is sex, right? They both have a lot to say about sex.
Hmm.
And so things like the Me Too movement and the subsequent Church Too movement, sexual abuse, sexual hypocrisy, abortion rights, access to reproductive care, like all these things, sexual orientation, came up in so many narratives. So it's hard to pick a standout or a favorite of those conversations. But I think the main thing that I would want people to know or take away from that chapter is that being a sexual being and a religious one aren't contradictory. And like, that's not news to anyone that's listened to me talk for the past 30 minutes. Like, that's my whole argument. Like, but is that contradictory? I don't know. In the conclusion of that chapter, I quote Kelsey Burke, who's a sociologist of religion. And in 2022, she gave this really interesting address to the Association of the Sociology of Religion, where she's really interrogating that idea. She talks about how people assume that the path to sexual freedom is to be not religious. And she's saying, like, that's not the case. Like, why do we think that? And so I think this chapter really illustrates the narrative and the idea that what we think about when we think about sex and Christianity is again shaped by white feminism, shaped by white Christianity, and it just looks a lot more complex than, oh well, I'm a trans person and so I can't be religious. There's plenty of trans Christians, or I enjoy promiscuous sex, or all these things. That's not necessarily in contradiction with someone's faith, just because the broader narratives say they are.
Gotcha. Well, what an amazing overview of the book. I hopefully the listeners go and track this book down. I want to chat a little bit about public scholarship as well. You're a part of the Sacred Rights cohort with regards to public scholarship training. Tell me a little bit about your experience and why what you got out of the entire experience with Sacred Rights.
I have a few friends that had gone through the program, and I didn't tell anybody this in the program, but I think that's like the third or fourth time I've applied
Oh.
because I was just so interested in doing it. And so I finally got in and I was like, yes, like it's my time. I guess I'm
Mm.
finally ready. Um, but for me, the biggest takeaway of it was like there was this refrain that came up again and again over the course of the sessions was Brooke being like, you know things. And the first time I heard it, I was like, yeah, I know things. Like, okay. But then by the end, I was like, you know what? I do know things and I can,
Confidence.
yeah, exactly. Like, it gave me confidence to share my work in a way that I have been wanting to. Somewhere along the way, and I think I have talked to other colleagues about this, I think grad school kind of beats the confidence out of you in a lot of ways. Um, but somewhere I had internalized the idea that my ideas, like they're good ideas, but like maybe I'm just not articulate enough to share them. Or what am I adding that's new or different? Like, I'm not the person. But Sacred Rights really kind of rewired my brain of like, you are the person. You do know things. And like you said, I left feeling like, you know what? Like, hell yeah, like I could do that. So I've always, like I mentioned, I've really been interested in doing it because as a feminist scholar, I want to share my work with people who are actually affected by these things, not just And I love my sociology of religion community. I really do. But it continues to be like mostly men, mostly white guys. And I want them, of course, to read this work because it's important for everybody. But I also want it to touch the people who I'm writing for and about. And yeah.
Oh, I love it. What kind of public scholarship projects are you excited about for the future?
Oh gosh. Sacred rights might have created a monster because
Love that.
I decided to start my own podcast.
Whoop whoop. Love it. Yep.
Um,
Promote it. Tell us what's up.
okay. It's called But Is It Feminist? And it is totally inspired by all the things I'm constantly wrestling with. During one of the sort of exercises we were doing in Sacred Rites, Brooke had pushed us to think about like, what is the question at the center of all your work? Like, what do you keep coming back to? And my question about everything is, but is it feminist? And I feel like so many people ask that question too. They'll see a Dove ad or watch a new reality show or hear a new pop single and be like, there will be the discourse, right? Capital T, capital D around like, but is that feminist?
Hmm.
And so I am talking with people about various topics, not just religious oriented, although that does come up a lot because of my background, but about different things in pop culture and asking ourselves, is that feminist? Right now, I have the demo episode out on Spotify and YouTube, and I'm recording over the summer with people to put a season out. I'm keeping the bar really low. I'm like, I will do a season and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as somebody who is almost 330 episodes into my own podcast, I I encourage you to do the season approach because that way it's like, okay, I got these eight as a standalone thing. And then it's like you take a little break and you recharge a little bit. And then if you want to do more, you can. You know what I mean? Which is something I never really considered. I just went as hard as I possibly could week after week for years and years. And now I'm like 8 years or something, 8 or 9 years into this thing, and it's really crazy. But that is awesome. Congratulations on that. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find you if they want to follow along with your work? So the podcast, But Is It Feminist, is out, but where else? Where would you direct people's attention?
Yeah, so you can find me on two different socials. I am pretty active on TikTok. My handle is Amanda is booked, and I spell Amanda like Amanda.
No, nice. I love that.
So I post on TikTok a lot about what I'm reading. So I'm pretty active on like book talk. So both what I'm reading academic wise and just like fun fiction. I post my little hobbies and my cats. I am also on Blue Sky at Amanda Dawn. I'm trying to be active on Blue Sky. I left X, and it's been hard to re-engage the same community.
Yeah, isn't it funny how when you have something that hits you at a certain time of your life, how it's so immersive and addictive, but then when you try to replace it with something years and years later, it just doesn't grab you the same way. I'm having the
No.
exact same experience where I
Yeah.
check Blue Sky like 2 or 3 times a week, and I
Yep.
just don't go hard on it, which I'm actually kind of happy about because I feel a little liberated from it.
I've been liberated. The
Exactly.
handcuff meme.
But so also you have the book Intersectional Identities of Christian Women in the United States, Faith, Race, and Feminism from Lexington Books. So definitely everybody go check that out. But Dr. Amanda Hernandez, what a lovely conversation. I've learned so much and I'm really enjoying the book. And I thank you for joining me to have a chat about the book, your podcast, and basically your life story as well and how you relate to the work that you do because it's so personal. And that's what makes your work stand out so much to me is how much your own lived experiences inspired your own career path. So I really loved hearing your story as well as your academic story because those two things were so intertwined in such interesting ways. So thank you so much for being here and joining me today.
Greg, thank you for having me. This was fun.